A siren wails somewhere in Paris, and the bakery still smells like butter. That's France in one snapshot. Romance with a protest permit. Here's the myth. France can keep generous pensions forever. The state will figure it out, and every reform attempt will get yelled back into the closet like an ugly sweater. Now, reality. France is running into a pension wall. Not a political wall, a math wall. And math is the one voter block you can't charm, bribe, or guilt trip. It just stands there with its arms crossed. Think of the pension system like a huge dinner tab at a crowded bistro. For decades, the tab got passed down the table smoothly. Lots of diners paying, fewer diners eating, everyone laughing, everyone tipping, nobody checking the receipt. But the table is changing. More people are staying for dessert. Fewer new diners are walking in. And the waiter, who is also the accountant, keeps tapping the bill with that polite smile that says, "So, who's covering this?" The conversation usually turns moral fast. People deserve dignity. True. Work is hard. Also true. The rich should pay. Maybe. The system is unfair. Often. But pensions don't run on vibes. They run on flows. Money in, money out, year after year. Like a bathtub, you can't stop filling once the faucet and the drain disagree. And here's the dark punchline. When the spreadsheet panics, it doesn't tweet. It just sends you the bill in slow motion. In this documentary, we're going to do something dangerous. Separate the myth from the mechanics. 7 reasons the math tightens from 3 sides at once. Aging, weak growth, and a tax burden that's already doing the splits. No yelling required. Just a flashlight. Stay with me, because the most important part isn't the protest you can see. It's the invisible design of the system itself. The part that quietly decides who pays, who gets paid, and who gets told to be realistic. So before we talk about demographics or taxes, we need to start with the engine under the hood. What kind of pension machine is France actually running? One that saves money, or one that spends today's money today? Myth: I paid into my pension. That money is sitting somewhere with my name on it, like a jar labeled precious pension. When I retire, the jar opens. Reality: in much of France's system, it's closer to a relay race than a savings account. In a pay-as-you-go structure, money collected from workers and employers today largely goes out today to people already retired. Picture a medieval castle with a moat. You imagine your contributions are stones being stacked into a wall for your future self. But the castle is being built and repaired while the battle is happening. The stones you carry and get handed to someone else immediately because the wall is already under pressure. That's not evil. It's a design choice. It can work well when the worker-to-retiree balance is comfortable, wages are rising, and the economy keeps moving forward. But pay-as-you-go has a personality trait. It hates surprises. It hates sudden aging, slow growth, or years where fewer people are working, earning, and contributing. Because there is no magical vault to raid. There is just the next paycheck. Here's the brutal part nobody says out loud at family dinner. When a system runs on current cash flow, every demographic shift becomes a budget meeting. You don't collect your own savings. You ask the living workforce, today and tomorrow, to keep the conveyor belt moving. And yes, people hear that and immediately go, "So it's a Ponzi scheme?" Careful. A Ponzi scheme lies about where the money comes from. A pay-as-you-go pension is painfully honest. It tells you up front the money comes from the next generation. The question isn't, is it a scam? The question is the next generation big enough, rich enough, and willing enough? Stay with me, because this is where the story stops being about slogans and becomes arithmetic with a pulse. Now add the political trap. Once you've promised monthly checks to millions of retirees, you can't just pause payments without detonating trust overnight. So the system becomes a ship that must keep sailing even when the wind changes. If the crew shrinks, you don't get to vote on gravity. You row harder, or you start throwing cargo overboard. Kicker line: the pension system isn't a piggy bank. It's a treadmill. And the belt doesn't stop because you're tired. So if money is flowing straight through, worker to retiree, everything depends on one question. How many workers are there per retiree, and how fast is that ratio changing? Because that's where the wall starts to look less like politics and more like physics. Myth: demographics are slow. We'll adapt. Besides, France has always been good at social protection. Reality: demographics are slow, and that's exactly why they're terrifying. A slow-moving glacier doesn't look dramatic until you notice it has already rearranged the valley. In a pay-as-you-go setup, the whole story hinges on people. How many are working? How many are retired? How long retirement lasts? If more people live longer, that's a human victory. But financially, it's also an invoice that gets longer every year. Imagine a small village bakery that promises every retired baker a baguette every morning for life. Beautiful. Then the retired bakers live longer. Also beautiful, but fewer apprentices show up to bake. Suddenly the oven is the same size, but the line at the counter is growing and the hands in the kitchen are shrinking. That's the squeeze. Pensions are a promise measured in time. The longer people spend retired, the more months the system has to pay. And if the number of workers doesn't keep up, each worker carries a heavier slice of the bridge. And this is where the pension wall stops being a French argument and becomes a universal math problem. Politically, this gets messy fast, because nobody wants to say the quiet sentence out loud. A society can be too old for its own promises. Not morally, mechanically, like trying to power a stadium with a handful of AA batteries. The system isn't straining because people are greedy. It's straining because birthdays keep happening. So what do governments do when the worker base thins out? They have only a few knobs to turn. They can try to increase the number of workers. They can adjust the benefits. They can ask people to work longer. Or they can try to collect more money per worker. And that last knob is where the next reason hits like a brick: taxes. Because if the solution is just fund it, the obvious follow-up is, with what exactly? So let's go there next. If France already runs a heavyweight welfare state, how much more can you squeeze out of the same economy before it starts to creak, leak, or simply refuse? Myth: if pensions cost more, just tax the rich. Or tax companies. Or, I don't know, tax air. France is a country. Countries have money. Reality: France is not a magic money tree. It's a very busy cashier with a long line, a tired scanner, and customers who already feel like they're paying for the entire store. A pension system can be generous in 3 ways. You can pay a lot in benefits. You can let people retire earlier. You can keep taxes comfortable. Pick 2. Sometimes pick 1. Because when demographics tighten, the easiest lever is the one you can see. Raise contributions. Raise payroll charges. Add a temporary surcharge that somehow survives longer than most marriages. And at first, it works. The state fills the gap. The checks go out. Nobody misses a month. But the bill doesn't disappear. It just changes costumes. Here's the part people underestimate. Taxes have a ceiling. Not a legal ceiling. A human ceiling. If workers feel every extra euro of wage turns into confetti before it reaches their pocket, they don't start singing patriotic songs. They start negotiating, opting out, leaving, or quietly giving up on the idea that effort pays. If businesses feel every hire comes with a second invisible employee named charges, they don't clap. They hesitate. They automate. They relocate. Or they simply don't grow. This is the pension wall's dirty joke. The system needs more money from the same economy, and the economy responds by producing less money to take. You end up trying to refill a bathtub by squeezing the sponge you're standing on. And yes, you can say tax the wealthy all day. That debate matters. But even if you win it, you still run into the same physics. A country can finance everything with a shrinking base forever. Quick pause here. If you like documentaries where spreadsheets get roasted like marshmallows, hit like and subscribe. I promise we only bully numbers, not people. Now, here's the mid-story twist. Even if France could raise more, higher taxes don't automatically solve pensions, because pensions are a promise that compounds over time. You patch 1 year, the next year shows up wearing the same problem, just slightly bigger. Kicker line: when your plan is just take a little more, eventually you run out of little. So what happens when taxes feel near the ceiling, but the pension bill keeps climbing anyway? Simple. You need growth. Real growth. The kind that makes the same tax rates collect more money without turning society into a pressure cooker. Which brings us to the next wall behind the wall. What if growth stays weak and the promises stay huge? Myth: France is a rich country. It will grow. Things always grow. That's what economies do, like plants, right? Reality: growth is not a law of nature. It's a mood, a machine, and sometimes a missing part. Pensions are one of the most growth-sensitive promises a country can make. Because the promise is fixed, but the ability to pay is not. Monthly checks don't care if the economy had a bad decade. They show up anyway, like a subscription you forgot to cancel, except the cancellation fee is social chaos. Think of the system like a long moving walkway at an airport. When the walkway is running, Even tired people keep moving forward. But if it slows down, everyone still has to reach the gate. So they start walking faster. They bump shoulders. They get angry. And the loudest arguments aren't about the walkway. They're about who should walk faster. When growth is weak, everything gets sharper. A small pension gap becomes a big political fight. A minor reform becomes a national trauma. And each new year feels like trying to pay tomorrow's rent with yesterday's paycheck. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If the economy isn't expanding much, then funding bigger retirement obligations means someone, somewhere, must accept a smaller share. Less wage growth, more contributions, lower benefits, later retirement, higher debt. Pick your flavor of pain. And debt is not a free snack. It's room service. It arrives fast, looks convenient, and later you realize you've been paying extra for the privilege of being hungry again tomorrow. Now, the twist that keeps this story sticky. Even if a country wants to protect retirees, low growth makes that protection feel like an attack on everyone else. Because workers aren't feeling richer, they're feeling squeezed. And when people feel squeezed, they stop trusting grand promises. Kicker line. In a slow economy, every pension promise is a beautiful speech taped to a leaking pipe. So the pension wall isn't only about the elderly living longer. It's also about the economy not getting much stronger. When both happen together, the system starts to look like a family trying to stretch one pizza across a growing guest list. And that sets up the next problem, the one that doesn't show up in budgets at first. It shows up in attitudes, in eye rolls, in the quiet decision to stop believing. Because if you're 25, watching all this, you don't ask, is this fair? First, you ask something colder. Will I ever get mine? Or am I just paying for a party that ends before I arrive? Myth. The pension system is a contract. You pay in, you get paid out. End of story. Reality. It only feels like a contract when both sides believe the other will still be there at the finish line. When you're young, pensions are not a monthly check. They're a rumor about the future. A promise you can't touch, can't test, can't taste. Meanwhile, the deductions on your payslip are very real. They arrive with the confidence of a parking ticket. So you get this weird emotional math. Older voters see pensions as earned money. Younger workers see pensions as a subscription they never agreed to that keeps raising the price. And once that feeling spreads, the system doesn't just face a funding problem. It faces a belief problem, because pay-as-you-go runs on compliance. Not just legal compliance, social compliance. The quiet acceptance that I'll carry some weight now because someone carried weight for me. But trust is like glass. It doesn't have to shatter loudly. It can crack silently, one headline at a time. One temporary tax that never leaves. One reform that changes the rules mid-game. One election where everyone promises opposite things, and somehow none of them are lying. Here's the dark irony. The more politicians say, don't worry, it's guaranteed, the more it sounds like a used car salesman tapping the hood. And this is where the pension wall becomes contagious. If younger workers don't believe they'll ever see the payoff, they change behavior. They save more on their own if they can. They push for cash now, not promises later. They resent deductions. They disengage. Some leave. Some stay and mentally check out. Kicker line. A pension system can survive bad demographics. It struggles to survive bad faith. Listen closely and you can hear it in everyday conversations. Not in think tanks. In cafes. In group chats. In the little shrug that says, yeah, sure, if it still exists. And once a society starts shrugging at its own future, every reform becomes harder. Because reforms require trust. You're asking people to accept pain now for stability later. That deal only works when later feels real. So the next question is brutal and simple. If trust is collapsing, why does reform keep getting stuck anyway? What turns a spreadsheet problem into street fire again and again? Myth. If the math is bad, politicians will fix it. That's their job. They'll make a plan, explain it, and people will accept it. Reality. Pensions are where math goes to get jumped in an alley. Because pensions aren't just a policy. They're a lifestyle calendar. They decide when your knees finally get to quit. They decide whether your last decade of life is soup and rent, or maybe, once in a while, a train ticket and a grandkid's birthday gift. So every reform lands like a personal letter, not a spreadsheet update. A letter that says, surprise, work longer, pay more, receive less. And people don't read that letter quietly. France has a long tradition of making political disagreement loud. Strikes, marches, shutdowns. A country that can turn a Tuesday into a national event. That isn't immaturity. It's leverage. It's the bargaining chip on the table. But here's the trap. Leverage works best when the other side can blink. The pension system can't blink. The checks must go out. The only question is who absorbs the pain. And that turns reform into a street-level war of narratives. One side says, you're breaking the social model. The other says, the social model is breaking us. Both can feel true, depending on which side of the payslip you live on. Here's the cruel mechanic. The costs of delay are invisible today, but loud tomorrow. If leaders postpone reform, nothing explodes immediately. It's like ignoring a weird noise in your car. The radio still works. The seat is warm. You convince yourself it's fine. Then one day the engine pays you back. Not with a moral lecture, with smoke. And because pensions are so emotional, politicians often sell reforms like a magic trick. They promise pain-free solutions. They choose euphemisms. They hide the sharp edges under technical language, which is understandable and also why trust keeps dying. A mid-story truth that stings. People don't riot because they love chaos. They riot when they think they're being cornered. Kicker line. In pension politics, compromise is just a word that means you lose, but politely. So the system gets stuck. Not because nobody sees the problem, but because every real fix has a real victim, and victims tend to show up with signs, whistles, and very strong opinions. And that brings us to the last reason, where the math stops asking nicely. If reforms stall, the bill still arrives. So what are the endgames? If the wall doesn't move, do we go through it with inflation, with austerity, or with quieter, hidden cuts that don't look like cuts until it's too late? Myth: France will never really cut pensions. It's political suicide, so it won't happen. Reality: when the bill keeps rising and the room to fund it stays tight, the system can still cut without using the word cut. Like a magician who never saws the box in half on camera, yet somehow the assistant still goes missing. There are basically three ways this story can end, or at least bend, if the pressure keeps building. Endgame 1 is inflation. Not the cartoon villain twirling a mustache. More like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice it on day one. Then one morning you're riding on the rim. If prices rise faster than benefits, retirees lose purchasing power without a single headline screaming cut. It's a haircut you didn't consent to, delivered by gravity. Endgame 2 is austerity. The blunt version. Freeze benefits. Trim indexation. Tighten eligibility. Raise retirement ages. Adjust formulas. The language is always sterile, like a hospital corridor. But the impact is personal, like finding out the stairs are now the only elevator. Endgame 3 is the quiet one. Hidden cuts through complexity. You keep the promise on paper, but you shift the edges. You change rules in ways that sound technical. You create exceptions, transition periods, special cases. People don't feel the loss all at once. They feel it as confusion, as paperwork, as wait, why is mine different? This is the bureaucratic version of turning down the volume while insisting the song is still playing. Here's the twist that makes these endgames so politically tempting. They can be framed as anything except a cut. Inflation can be framed as global conditions. Austerity can be framed as responsibility. Hidden cuts can be framed as modernization. Same result, different packaging. Kicker line: in politics, pain is unavoidable. What's negotiable is whether you can rename it. And none of this is guaranteed. These are scenarios. Paths a country might drift toward if the math keeps tightening and reforms keep stalling. But the reason the pension wall matters is that it narrows the menu. Eventually, choices stop being dreamy and start being mechanical. So when people say, France always protests and then moves on, they're half right. France moves on. The math moves too, just not in the direction anyone is cheering for. Now let's pin the ugly question to the wall. If you had to choose one, raise the retirement age, cut benefits, or raise taxes, which option is the least unfair and why? Because in the final section, we're going to zoom out and land this plane. What the pension wall really means, what a realistic moral choice could look like, and what happens if a society keeps treating arithmetic like an opinion. So, what's the honest ending when nobody gets everything they want? Myth: France will figure it out. It always does. A little drama, a few strikes, then life goes on. Reality: life goes on, but the math goes with it. And the pension wall is what happens when a promise meets a population curve, slow growth, and a tax system that already feels maxed out. Here's the moral without the sermon. A pension isn't a gift from the state. It's a claim on future workers. That claim can be fair, humane, and stable if the country keeps the engine strong enough to honor it. But if the engine stays weak, one scenario is simple: the system adjusts anyway. Maybe through inflation nibbling away. Maybe through blunt reforms. Maybe through quiet rule changes that feel like fog, until you realize you're already lost. And that's why protests, elections, and headlines matter, but they can't repeal arithmetic. The brutal joke is that everyone can be right and still be stuck. Retirees can be right to defend dignity. Workers can be right to feel squeezed. Governments can be right to fear chaos. And the spreadsheet can still say, pick something. You can't negotiate with a calendar. It just keeps flipping pages. So what does realistic look like? It looks like trade-offs, explained like adults, not sold like perfume. It looks like choosing which pain is least unfair, then spreading it with as much honesty as politics can tolerate. If you want more stories where the myths get tested against the ledger, subscribe.